Good day, friends. Welcome to another Word of Gord. Today we're going back to our Average Folks in the Afterlife series, number 16, after a gap that was much longer than I intended. And I apologize to you for that. I got busy with other things, often very mundane things. But we will now continue, and we will continue right after the end point of number 15, same book, Peter Richelieu, A Soul's Journey, and we were left at the, how shall we say, opening of a Deva ceremony. And we will now find out what that is all about. I felt he had asked me whether we could do anything for us. I told him merely by allowing the thought to express itself in my mind that Daphne was a permanent inhabitant of the astral world, whereas I was still living in a physical body in the world and was here during the period when my body was sleeping. He seemed to understand perfectly and said he had been instructed by his chief to bring us to him. We intimated that we were only too willing to accompany him and at once moved toward the central arena. As we approached, I saw the people were standing and sitting around a large open circle. Wildflowers had been strung together to help keep back the crowds, and I could not help comparing the beauty of that fence with those we see in the world. Just within the circle, a dais had been erected, made entirely of great clumps of green moss with pillars at each corner, formed of intertwined flowers of every size and color. Even the awning above the dais was made of a very delicate fern, not unlike our maidenhair variety. The whole formed a most beautiful picture. The moss on the floor of the dais had been laid in such a way that there appeared to be numerous seats with shaped backs, which looked so comfortable that one immediately wished to sit down. At the front there were two large seats, almost like thrones, and although these were composed of moss, they were more intricate than the others. While we waited for the chief to appear, our guide told us something of what was about to take place. The gist of what he said was that the crowd had gathered together to witness a graduation ceremony. He explained that when the time came for a group of nature spirits to pass to the next stage in their evolution, which was to become devas, they had to give proof of their proficiency at one of these gatherings. Provided they satisfied a council of examiners, they were changed from nature spirits into devas, with more responsible duties. He said that the younger egos evolved along one of three special lines of work. 1, the power line, working through music and color. 2, the guidance of the vegetable kingdom, which derived its change and progress from experiments made at the astral level by members of the Deva evolution. And 3, work in connection with the human kingdom. He explained that the nature spirits mixed quite frequently with human beings, particularly children. They often played with those who came to the astral world at an early age, and taught them how to make use of the plastic astral matter, so as to live their fairy stories in very truth, by changing at will so as to represent any figure of fiction for so long as they required, and so long as the thoughts of those taking part lasted. It was impressed on me that this sphere of the astral world is for the Deva kingdom what the physical world is for the human kingdom. Between lives, birds return to this fourth sphere in the same way that animals inhabit the sixth and seventh sphere, where they are awaiting their return to the world. Birds, as well as fish, butterflies, and many other winged creatures eventually change into nature spirits and are part of the Deva evolution. They never become part of our human evolution. I'd just like to say there is some evidence, some reports, some written reports, and some interviews that suggest that that guideline, that rule, that viewpoint is no longer holding, and there is movement between the human line of evolution and the Deva line. And we'll get into that, not in this book, but in other videos later. At this stage, a group emerged from a nearby coppice. If I ever had imagined the fairy story of the magic carpet come to life, surely this was it. The group consisted of two central figures, both seated cross-legged on what can only be described as a ceremonial carpet, floating a yard above the ground. From each front corner, strands of flowers were held in the beaks of numerous birds of every colour imaginable. And whilst these flew ahead, seemingly pulling the carpet along, other devas taking part in the procession floated majestically on either side. More little birds flew backwards and forwards, dropping rose petals in the path of the procession, each bird swooping down to the ground, picking a petal with its beak from the rose bushes that grew everywhere, and at once returning to its position ahead of the procession, from where the petal was dropped. Whilst the procession slowly wended its way, the air was filled with notes, the notes issuing from the throats of thousands of birds of all types. The procession reached its destination, and the two central figures were escorted to the special thrones prepared for them on the dais. The first of the two figures was the chief, and the second the high priest, and judging from the ceremonial robes that he wore, this was unmistakable. And as the other officials took their place on the dais, our guide presented Daphne and me to the chief, who had intimated that we were to seat ourselves on the platform. Daphne was offered a seat at his right hand, and I was given a seat to the immediate left of the high priest. Before the ceremony proper commenced, some music was played by a large orchestra composed entirely of devas, and it was an extremely cheerful and melodious character. After the orchestra had finished playing, there was silence again. Even the myriads of birds uttered no sound whatsoever. A herald then entered the inner circle with a small silver trumpet and proclaimed the first part of the ceremony. A small group of nature spirits came into the arena. Although no words were spoken, a question was passed from the principal examiner to the group. It related to the expression of sounds as representing a slowly moving river, lazily passing through wooded country with tall trees on either side of the riverbank. Once the group produced wind instruments and a curious sort of guitar. They commenced to play, and I thought I saw the thought form slowly taking shape, showing exactly what they were endeavouring to illustrate through sound. This was immediately followed by another order to produce music that expressed the elements. At once the instruments were changed, and several drums, one set of cymbals, and two other larger, quite unusual instruments, rather like oboes, were introduced. Again they played, and it was not difficult to realize, even without looking at the thought form so clearly outlined before us, that a storm at sea was the subject of the theme then played. One could hear the creaking of the stays and halyards, strained to their utmost by the force of the gale. Thunder and lightning played their part as this group finished. The crowd stood up as a body, raising their hands to the sky, and instead of clapping and cheering as we would do. That was all the first group was asked to do, and I was sure the members had successfully passed the tests. The second group was now heralded into the circle. There were only 5 of them. They were asked to demonstrate the result of certain graftings as related to both flowers and shrubs and to different kinds of fruit. The answers appeared immediately as thought-form pictures, showing very clearly the changes in color and size. They were also asked what kind of flowers could be grown together in one bed, and which kinds meant death to one or more of the species. Then questions concerning crop rotation and why it was necessary. This second group also seemed to satisfy both examiners and the crowd. The silver trumpet sounded again, and a third group of very small nature spirits then entered the circle, and thought forms of 3 human children were created by the examiners. They were typical fair-haired children of an age between 5 and 7. They discussed the fairy story of Cinderella, and at once they were joined by the nature spirits, who entered into the spirit of the game. They argued as to who should take the principal part, and when this was settled, I noticed that the nature spirits took over the parts that the children usually object to play. They became the ugly sisters and the unpleasant mother, leaving the parts of Cinderella, the fairy godmother, and the prince for the children. A short version of the play was enacted, but the transformation scenes covering the fairy carriage and the change of Cinderella's clothes were much more realistic than anything that has ever been produced under physical plane conditions. I imagine the unselfishness shown by the little nature spirits made the difference between passing or failing the test. After a short interval with cheerful music, all the members of the three groups who had been examined were called back into the arena. The herald sounded the entrance on his silver trumpet. The examiners grouped round the chief and high priest, then drew together as if to confer on what they had seen. And after a few moments the chief examiner stood before the chief and obtained his consent for the nature spirits to promote to the Deva rank. The high priest then rose to his feet, bowed to the chief, and solemnly walked into the arena, where the nature spirits were standing. For the first time words were used. The high priest, raising his hands above his head, intoned an invocation in the same unknown language I had heard in the glade on the third sphere. The herald then handed him a large sword, the blade of which shone brightly in the clear astral light. Raising it toward the sky, he uttered more words and slowly walked to the first of the nature spirits, who stood in one long line in front of him. He placed the sword on the head of the first and said two words which seemed to mean, "God go with thee," although why I thought this I do not know. And as I watched, the form of the nature spirit, which had appeared that of a little old man, changed to that of a young girl. The same thing happened to all the graduates. Some male nature spirits became male devas, whereas others changed their sex. All the newly created bodies were young in appearance. I was about to thank the chief for the wonderful opportunity offered to us when, without any warning, I felt my body calling to me and I found myself awake in Colombo. On the following Saturday night, when I got out of my body, I found Jim, the astral helper I had met in the London hospital, waiting for me. He had come to ask for my help. He stated that he had been very impressed by the way in which I'd handled the case of the girl, whose name was Mary, on the Thursday night, and felt I could give further help. The girl had learned from a thoughtless visitor that her mother had been killed in the raid, and was so upset that no one could do anything with her. As there was a younger sister, Irene, aged 7, it would be a tragedy if Mary died too. I was only too glad to have this opportunity of putting into practice what I had recently learned. When we reached the ward, I saw Mary's fever-racked body tossing on the bed, whilst the girl herself was pacing the ward, metaphorically tearing her hair. She welcomed my arrival, and as I talked soothingly to her, quietened down. I made a thought form of a comfortable settee, and whilst we sat there, I gave her what help I could from the knowledge which had given to me by Achaira. I brought the conversation round to Irene and pointed out how she would suffer if both her mother and sister died. I assured Mary with an authority I did not possess that she could live if she made the effort, and if she elected to do so, she would still be able to contact her mother during sleep. She asked me if I would help her. I promised to do so and thus took on myself a measure of responsibility. I said I would return the following night. On the Sunday night, Mary was waiting for me and was quite calm. I suggested we look for her mother. I showed her how easy it was to travel under astral conditions, and soon this method of progress both interested and intrigued her. She took me to the block of flats where they lived. We found Irene in a neighbour's flat, and by her bedside her mother was sitting endeavouring to comfort the weeping child who could not see her. At first the mother thought Mary was dead too, but then she realized this was not the case and that she would be able to care for Irene. She then calmed down. I left the three of them to chat, and after arranging to meet them there, returned to the hospital. I watched Jim and his colleagues working and made notes of their methods. When Mary, her mother, and Irene came in, I spent the rest of my night trying to help them in the way Achaira had helped me. The mother was not a very highly evolved person. I had learned from an astral helper that it had taken 2 days to persuade her to make the effort of will to disconnect herself from her etheric body. At last she seemed to grasp that the link with her family was not broken and that she would still see them at night. This made her much happier. I fancy she will be quite content with the first sphere conditions for some time. My last act before returning to my body was to use what willpower I possessed to impress upon Irene that when she awakened she must remember something of what she had been told during her sleep. And I might add that's something I do quite a bit when I'm trooping my various students and friends around in the astral. Various little rituals that we perform on focusing the consciousness on the brain cells of the sleeping physical body so that something of the night's explorations is recalled by the walking, not the walking wounded, but the walking living the next day. Anyway, that's all for this one. There's plenty more in this book, but we'll keep the episodes shorter so that you can absorb them at your ease. And for now, I wish you well, and we'll talk again soon. Bye bye.